Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Have you ever wondered exactly how a media narrative gets built, literally brick by brick? Well, today, we're putting a specific piece of political commentary under the microscope to see exactly how that happens. We're taking a close look at a recent, highly critical segment from Sky News Australia, which was aimed squarely at Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. Now, just to be super clear up front, in this explainer, we aren't taking sides or endorsing any viewpoints. Instead, our goal is to neutrally deconstruct the broadcaster's argument piece by piece. We really want to understand the exact structure, the evidence they select, and the rhetorical techniques they use to build their case against the Prime Minister.
All right, let's dive right in. To really grasp any critique, you kind of have to start with its core thesis. The segment opens with a massive, sweeping claim, essentially arguing that a successful nation absolutely requires trust between its leaders and its population. The broadcaster states there has to be some connection between words and actions, ultimately diagnosing what they call a dangerous delusion. So the core thesis here is that the Prime Minister has a severe credibility problem. The broadcaster argues this isn't just about minor PR gaffes, but a consistent, ingrained pattern of behavior that stretches all the way up to major national policies.
To make sense of all this, we're going to break the broadcaster's rapid-fire claims down into 5 parts. First, the anatomy of the critique. Second, denying the evidence. Third, reversing policy promises. Fourth, delays and deflections. And finally, promises versus values.
Starting off with Part 1, Anatomy of the Critique, establishing the baseline.
The very first technique the source uses is actually anchoring their argument way back in the past, suggesting a long-standing character flaw. The segment compares a speech from the Prime Minister's early career with, get this, dialogue delivered by Michael Douglas in the Hollywood movie The American President. They play these clips back to back, highlighting a moment of outright plagiarism. But the absolutely crucial point the broadcaster makes here isn't just that the plagiarism happened. It's that, according to the segment, the PM simply laughed it off as a mistake. By starting right here, the broadcaster establishes a baseline. They are framing a narrative that this is a leader who has historically been loose with his words and super casual about accountability. Moving right along to Part 2, denying the evidence, focusing on physical and public gaffes. So, shifting from the past into the present, the broadcaster bundles together a few recent public relations incidents to build their next pillar of critique. They use these specific events to argue that the PM flat-out denies objective reality. Take the domestic violence rally, for example. The PM stated he asked to speak, was told it wasn't possible, and respected that right. However, the source points out that the rally organizer dug in and publicly contradicted him, with the broadcaster concluding he lied live on stage. Or, take the interaction with activist Grace Tame. The PM claimed he was referring to her having a difficult life, while the source implies it was a clear backpedal from calling her a difficult person. The broadcaster groups these moments together to argue there's a clear pattern of spinning the narrative whenever he's caught in an awkward position.
And notice the exact phrasing the broadcaster highlights next. After a physical stumble on a stage, the PM was quoted saying, "I didn't fall off the stage, just one leg went down. I was sweet." The source uses this specific quote to paint a picture of someone who flat-out refuses to admit basic, visible facts. The argument being constructed here is pretty straightforward. If a leader cannot admit to a simple, harmless physical stumble that everyone literally saw, how can they be trusted to tell the truth on larger, much more complex issues?
This argument flows directly into what happened at the Lakemba Mosque. The segment contrasts widespread media reports of aggressive heckling and booing outside the mosque with the PM's own recollection of the event. The PM stated he saw not a single person heckling outside and actually described the massive 30,000-person reception as incredibly positive. By contrasting the video evidence of the booing with the PM's incredibly sunny description, the source attempts to cement their claim that the PM lives in an imagined reality and tries to just pretend uncomfortable truths away.
All right, Part 3, Reversing Policy Promises, looking at the economic flip-flops.
Now here is where the broadcaster really escalates the critique. We're moving from PR spin to hard national economic policy, with the argument that this behavior has real-world financial consequences for everyday people. The number 275 is front and center in their economic argument. This represents the pre-election promise of a $275 power price cut per household. The segment notes that since that promise was made, power prices have dramatically increased. But the core of the critique isn't just the broken promise itself, it's the reaction to it. The source highlights how the PM deflected ownership of the failure, claiming it was simply Reputex modeling based upon the circumstances at that time. The argument is that he didn't admit a broken promise, he basically disowned it entirely.
And then there's this number, 50. According to this segment, specifically citing journalist James O'Doherty, this is how many times the PM allegedly ruled out changes to negative gearing and the capital gains tax before the election. 50 times. The broadcaster uses this massive number to emphasize just how incredibly concrete and repeated these pre-election assurances were.
This is where the rubber really meets the road. Before the election, the Prime Minister was super direct, stating categorically negative gearing is off the table. But post-election, when faced with rampant speculation about budget changes, his response completely shifts to, the key to housing policy is supply. The broadcaster plays these clips to draw a stark contrast. They use this to argue that the PM treats direct questions with bizarre diversions, entirely abandoning the categorical nature of his past statements the moment it becomes politically convenient.
Into part 4 now, delays and deflections, focusing on national security.
The Sky News segment frames this section as absolutely the most serious part of their critique. It's all about the government's handling of the Bondi Beach terror attack and the push for a Royal Commission. Let's trace the timeline they lay out. In December, right after the attack, the PM repeatedly rejects calls from Jewish leaders and political opponents for a Royal Commission, insisting the Richardson Review was sufficient. This rejection continues right into early January. Then, suddenly, on January 8th, the PM calls a Royal Commission. The source maps this out to show a leader digging his heels in, only to completely reverse course due to mounting public pressure.
But again, the broadcaster's main target here is the spin. When he announced the Royal Commission on January 8th, the PM is quoted as saying, "We've also been working through these recommendations over a long period of time." The source totally seizes on this quote. They argue that instead of just admitting he changed his mind, the PM pretended he had been planning the commission all along, despite weeks of public on-the-record rejections. For the broadcaster, this is the ultimate proof of their thesis, a leader who they claim treats the public like fools rather than practicing transparent government.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 5, Promises versus Values, the Ideological Shift.
This is the big, overarching philosophical critique the Sky News segment uses to tie all these disparate threads together. The broadcaster points out a very specific rhetorical shift. They note that the PM has increasingly used the phrase labor values post-election. When pressed on why people should believe promises made during an election campaign when new budget measures seem to directly conflict with them, the PM's defense was that the budget is consistent with the values that we took to the election. The source's argument here is super fascinating from a media analysis perspective. They claim the PM has strategically swapped out concrete, measurable promises for subjective, undefinable values.
And that brings us to the climax of the segment's argument. The broadcaster concludes that this shift from concrete promises to vague values is a deliberate tactic to avoid accountability. By their logic, if you only promise values, you can never technically break a promise because values are entirely subjective. Ultimately, the segment argues that in this government, the truth is treated as subjective, and that truth itself is not a core value they hold dear. Now, just reiterating our neutral stance on this explainer, we are simply observing how the broadcaster structurally built this political commentary from the ground up, moving from a Hollywood movie quote to a sweeping philosophical indictment.
So we've seen exactly how a media outlet can construct a narrative of dangerous delusion, linking physical stumbles, disputed rally interactions, and major policy reversals, but it all really boils down to this final thought. When you watch political rhetoric evolve like this, you have to ask yourself, when do concrete election promises become subjective political values? And what does that shift actually mean for how we hold our leaders accountable? Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer, and we'll see you next time.